She was only 6 years old when she offered up the very thing that was sustaining her. The winter gale sliced through the cabin's timber walls, and young Evelyn Rose pulled her worn shawl more snugly around her little frame. Yet, when she noticed the small native infant, his lips cracked and dry in his mother's frantic embrace, an impulse in her young heart sparked a decision that would alter their fates. The blizzard had been howling for 3 straight days, isolating everyone at the remote trading post. Samuel Rose, Evelyn's father, paced by the hearth, his weathered hands clenched as he observed the snow drifting ever higher against the window pines. His wife, Elena, sat on a wooden crate, attempting to shield their daughter with the scant warmth from the faltering fire. Through the ice-laced glass, they could observe the small band of native people sheltering beneath the building's overhang. A woman from the tribe cradled her baby, but even from a distance, they could tell the child was barely stirring. The infant's lips were alarmingly pale and split, and his mother's expression conveyed a desperation that needed no translation. Evelyn pressed her small face to the frigid window, her breath creating a patch of fog on the glass as she watched. The baby was so motionless, so silent. She considered her own thirst, even with the small sips she was allowed, and pictured how much worse it must be for that tiny baby with nothing at all. "Mama," she murmured, tugging at Elena's sleeve. "That baby is thirsty." Elena's gaze shifted to the window and her heart ached. She recognized that look, a mother watching her child fade away, completely helpless. But Samuel's rules were firm. They were not to engage with the native people. It was too dangerous, he'd insisted, too fraught with complication. "I know, my dear," Elena whispered back, drawing Evelyn nearer. "But we cannot do anything yet." Evelyn continued to watch the baby. She saw the native woman try to moisten his lips with snow, saw her own parched mouth moving in silent prayer. The infant's cries had faded throughout the day until he was making almost no sound. Samuel strode to the window and pulled the curtain shut with a sharp tug. "Don't look," he ordered. "We must worry about our own family." Evelyn felt her father's anxiety, but she also felt a different sensation, a tightness in her chest and a sting in her eyes. She glanced down at the small canteen of water at her mother's side, the last of their clean supply, the water that tasted of life and survival. The trading post proprietor, a gruff fellow named Morrison, had already declared the natives were not permitted inside. They could use the shelter of his eaves to wait out the blizzard, but that was the extent of his charity. He grumbled about avoiding trouble from any side. As darkness descended, the temperature plunged. Evelyn could hear the wind moaning like a creature in agony. She tried to sleep on the hard floor where her family had arranged their bedrolls, but rest eluded her. Each time she shut her eyes, she envisioned the baby's cracked lips and heard his weakening whimpers fade to nothing. In the gloom, she could hear her parents' urgent, hushed conversation. Her father's voice was strained with tension, her mother's soft with what sounded like a plea. They were afraid, too, she understood. Afraid of the storm, of their dwindling food, of what would happen if their supplies ran out before they could reach the next settlement. Evelyn turned over, listening to the gale. Just a few feet away, through a wooden wall, a baby was perishing. A baby who looked different, whose mother spoke a language she did not know, but who was just as helpless and thirsty as she was. She sat up quietly, taking care not to disturb her parents. Through a gap in the curtain, she could make out the dim form of the native woman still cradling her infant, still trying to offer comfort with nothing but her own presence. It was then that Evelyn made a choice that would challenge all her family's notions of survival, trust, and humanity in a world that seemed bent on extinguishing kindness. What she was about to do would trigger a series of events none of them could foresee, and the tribe's reaction would upend everything the settlers believed they knew about the people they considered strangers. Evelyn moved like a phantom, her bare feet silent on the icy wooden floor. The trading post was lit only by the dying coals in the hearth, which threw shifting shadows across the room. Her parents were sleeping restlessly close by, her father's arm draped protectively over her mother. She crept toward the door, their precious canteen of water clutched in her hands. Her heart beat so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire building, but the howling wind masked her movements. The heavy door was frigid to the touch, and she needed both hands to lift the iron latch without a sound. The moment she pulled it open, the Arctic air struck her like a solid force. Snow swirled, stinging her skin, but she forged ahead. There, huddled against the wall under the narrow overhang, sat the native woman and her baby. The woman glanced up, startled, as the small figure emerged from the storm. Her dark eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and fear, but they also held a fierce protectiveness that reminded Evelyn of her own mother. The baby in her arms was terrifyingly still. Evelyn advanced cautiously, the way her father had taught her to approach frightened animals. She held out the canteen with both hands, her small voice almost lost in the gale. The woman stared at her, confusion and weariness mingling on her face. Without speaking, Evelyn moved closer and gently tipped a small amount of water onto her own hand, then offered it to the baby's lips. The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked from the canteen to the little girl's face, as if searching for a trick. But Evelyn just gave a small, shivering smile and gestured from the canteen to the baby. The universal language of a child's kindness required no words. The woman's expression softened, and tears streamed down her face as she took the canteen and let a few precious drops fall onto her child's mouth. "Evelyn!" Her father's voice cut through the tempest like a whip. She spun to see Samuel in the doorway, his face a mask of fury and dread. Behind him, Elena was awake, trying to make sense of the scene. "Get away from them this instant." Samuel's voice held a terror that made Evelyn's stomach clench, but she stood her ground. She couldn't move. The baby was already beginning to stir, swallowing the water, and the native woman was clutching him, whispering what sounded like prayers in her tongue. Samuel surged forward into the snow, but Elena grabbed his arm. "Samuel, wait!" Look, the native woman was speaking now, soft words none of them understood but which carried the clear tone of gratitude. She tipped the canteen again, showing them how the water was already reviving him. The child's breathing seemed to deepen, his lips less alarmingly pale. Morrison appeared in the doorway, roused by the disturbance. "What in blazes is happening out here?" he yelled, then stopped abruptly at the sight. "Get that girl inside before she freezes." He then pointed at the native woman. "I knew, keep your distance," but something had changed in those few moments in the storm. The woman met Samuel's gaze directly, her own eyes filled with a combination of desperate thanks and proud dignity. She spoke again, her voice stronger, and though they could not comprehend her words, they felt the emotion behind them. Evelyn was now shivering uncontrollably, her thin nightdress offering no defense against the brutal cold. Elena darted forward and scooped her daughter up, carrying her back to the warmth of the post. But Evelyn kept looking back over her mother's shoulder at the woman and her child. Inside, Elena wrapped her daughter in Samuel's greatcoat and held her by the fire. "What were you thinking?" she murmured, her voice filled more with awe than anger. "You could have caught your death out there." Samuel paced the floor. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked, his tone gentler now. "That was the last of our drinking water. And now—" He gestured helplessly toward the door. But Evelyn was not focused on his practical fears. She was thinking of how the baby's face had changed after the water, how his mother's tears looked different from the tears of grief she had been crying before. Outside, the wind continued to rage, but something else was happening. They could hear voices in the native language, more than just the mother's. Others had appeared in the blizzard, though how they traveled in this weather was a mystery. Morrison moved to the window, peering through the frost. "Well, he breathed. Looks like the whole tribe is here." Samuel joined him, his face draining of color. In the swirling snow, they saw figures moving, dark shapes on horseback emerging like specters from the storm. A dozen of them, perhaps more, all converging on the trading post. Elena hugged Evelyn tighter, her heart pounding. Had her daughter's compassion just placed them all in mortal danger? Samuel's hand went instinctively to his rifle, and Morrison was already grabbing his shotgun. But the native woman outside was calling to the approaching riders, her voice carrying over the wind. She was holding up the canteen, showing it to them, speaking quickly in words that sounded vital and momentous. What none of the settlers inside could know was that news of the little girl's gift had already reached the tribal camp through means they couldn't fathom. And what was approaching was not a war party, but something far more consequential, something that would turn their beliefs about friendship, enemies, and survival completely on their heads. The riders dismounted with a quiet reverence, their forms taking shape out of the blizzard-like apparitions. Samuel tightened his grip on his rifle, but something about their demeanor made him pause. There was no menace in their approach, no weapons brandished. Instead, they created a respectful perimeter around the mother and her child. An older man with long, grey hair blowing in the wind stepped forward. His very presence seemed to command the storm to lessen. He spoke to the woman in their shared tongue, his voice deep and deliberate. She answered him rapidly, holding up the canteen and gesturing toward the trading post. Morrison swore under his breath. "This is just what I feared. A whole war party on my doorstep because your daughter meddled," but Elena was observing the scene more keenly. "Look at them, Samuel. Really look. Does that look like a war party to you?" She was right. The riders were not in a formation for attack. They seemed to be shielding the woman and child, using their horses and their own bodies as a windbreak. Several had dismounted and were sharing furs, creating a more substantial shelter. The grey-haired man walked toward the trading post door, his hands held open and empty. He stopped at the threshold and called out in a heavily accented but clear voice, "We wish to speak." With the child who gave life water to our own, Morrison looked ready to bolt the door, but Samuel surprised them all by stepping forward. "She is just a small girl," he called back. "She didn't understand, she understood everything that matters," came the response. "May we come inside?" The storm shouts too loudly for good talk. The request hung in the frosty air. Morrison shook his head no, but Elena was already moving toward the door. "Samuel, that baby might have died. Our daughter may have saved him, and what now?" Samuel retorted. "They come to demand payment? They take her." But Evelyn wriggled free from her mother's grasp and went to the door. Despite her father's protests, she reached up and began to lift the latch. The adults were too surprised to intervene before she had pulled the door open. The grey-haired man looked down at her, his weathered face solemn but not unkind. Behind him, the mother and her baby stepped forward. The child, now swaddled in furs, had a healthy color and was making soft noises of contentment. "You are very small to have such a large spirit," the man said to Evelyn. The mother spoke urgently to the man, gesturing from Evelyn to her baby. The man nodded gravely and looked back at the little girl. "Iona says you saw her son fading and chose to save him with your own life water. She says you shared your own survival to protect a stranger." Evelyn nodded, though she was shivering in the doorway. "He looked thirsty," she said simply. The man translated her words, and a murmur went through the group of natives. Several of them shared glances that seemed to hold profound significance. The grey-haired man knelt to Evelyn's eye level. "In our way, such a gift has great meaning. When one saves the life of another, especially a child, a debt is made that must be paid." Samuel stepped protectively beside his daughter. "She wants nothing. She's a child who didn't know the consequences." The man rose slowly, his gaze moving from Samuel to Elena and back to Evelyn. "Knowledge and consequence are not the same. What your daughter has done will be told for generations. But first, the debt of this night must be answered." He signaled to his people, and several began moving toward their horses. Samuel tensed, his hand inching back toward his rifle. But what followed defied every fear he held about this encounter. What the tribal people were about to do would challenge all the settlers' beliefs about generosity, honor, and reciprocity. In a land where survival often meant choosing yourself over others, the tribal members began to unpack bundles from their horses, moving with quiet purpose through the storm. Samuel watched in baffled silence as they brought out items that seemed impossible to possess in such weather: thick furs, dried meats, bundles of medicinal herbs, and most astonishingly, a finely woven blanket that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The grey-haired man, clearly their leader, directed them with subtle hand signals. He spoke again to Samuel, his voice clear above the wind. "I am Takakota. Your daughter's action cannot be left unanswered. A life debt must be honored without delay." "We don't want anything," Samuel insisted, though his voice trembled. "She gave the water freely, freely given, freely returned," Takakota replied. "But with the interest that honor requires." Iona, the young mother, came forward, her baby still resting peacefully. She spoke to Takakota in their language, her words filled with emotion. The other tribal members listened, nodding in agreement. Takakota turned back to the settlers. Iona wishes for you to know. Your daughter did not just save her son from thirst. She saved him from death. The boy was passing from this world. Without that water, he would not have seen the morning. Elena gasped, pulling Evelyn close. The true weight of her daughter's act was settling in. This wasn't just a kind gesture, it was a life saved. She also asks you to understand, Takakota went on. The baby your daughter saved is the grandson of our most revered medicine woman, the great-grandson of a chief whose line goes back many generations. Your daughter saved not just a life, but a future. Morrison, who had been quiet, finally spoke. This is all very touching, but we're in a blizzard. Can't this wait? Takakota's gaze settled on Morrison with an intensity that made the trader flinch. Honor does not wait on the weather. A debt of this size requires an immediate answer. The tribe had finished arranging items in the snow near the doorway, creating what looked like a formal offering. We give these not as payment, for no payment can equal a gift, Takakota explained. We offer them as recognition of the spirit in that small child. He pointed to the display. Furs, so she will be warm for many winters. Food, so her family will not go hungry. Medicine, to keep her safe from sickness. And this, he lifted the shimmering blanket. This was woven by our eldest grandmother. It carries blessings to protect your daughter all her days. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes wide with awe at the beautiful blanket. It seemed to capture a light that wasn't there, glowing with its own warmth against the snow. But Samuel was still wary. Why give so much for a little water? What do you truly want? Takakota's face grew serious. You do not see the full meaning of what took place. Your daughter looked upon a dying child of a different people, with different words and different skin, and she saw not an enemy, but a soul in need. In a world that teaches us to fear what is different, she chose compassion. The wind seemed to fall silent for a moment, as if listening. Such spirits are rare, Takakota said. They must be honored and nurtured. What we give is not a transaction, but a recognition of something sacred. Elena was moved to tears, finally seeing that this was something profound. This was about acknowledging a spirit that transcended the barriers that divided them. But as Takakota reached out to give the precious blanket to Evelyn, a new voice sliced through the night, a harsh, angry shout that carried the sound of approaching horses and the promise of trouble. Well, looks like we found ourselves a little party. Everyone turned as a group of rough-looking men emerged from the storm, their faces hardened by the kind of prejudice that had poisoned the frontier for years. The leader of this new group was looking at Evelyn and her family with a smile that promised nothing but pain. For sometimes, when two worlds try to meet, there are those who benefit from keeping them apart. And they were all about to learn how far some would go to protect the hatred that scarred the land. The newcomers rode in like omens of violence. Their leader was a scarred man with cold eyes and a sneer born of a lifetime spent hating. Behind him were four others, all armed, all wearing the same look of simmering aggression. Name's Garrett, the leader announced, not dismounting. Heard there was trouble with the natives at Morrison's. Looks like we got here just in time. Morrison stepped forward. No trouble here, Garrett. Just people waiting out the blizzard. Garrett's laugh was a grating sound. No trouble? I see a pack of savages around white folks. That's trouble enough for me. His eyes landed on the gifts in the snow. Looks like they're trying to buy their way out of something. Or maybe buy someone. Takakota stood perfectly still, but Samuel saw the subtle shift among the tribal members. They were not preparing for an attack, but they were ready to defend themselves. They aren't buying anything, Samuel said, moving in front of his family. My daughter helped their child, and they're showing thanks. Helped their child. Garrett spat on the ground. You let your girl get mixed up in their business? That ain't helping, friend. That's asking for it. Evelyn, clutching her mother's hand, looked up at the angry man, confused. She couldn't grasp why helping a thirsty baby would make someone so mad. Iona sensed the shift in mood and pulled her infant closer, speaking urgently to Takakota. The old leader's face darkened, but his voice was calm when he spoke to Garrett. "We seek no fight. We came only to honor a debt and answer kindness." "Debt?" Garrett laughed again. "The only debt you people understand is the one you owe for all the trouble you cause. And the only payment I'm interested in is you getting far away from decent peoples." One of Garrett's men added, "Maybe we ought to teach them what happens when they get too bold." The tension became a palpable thing, like the air before a lightning strike. Elena pulled Evelyn behind her as Morrison retreated toward his doorway, wanting no part of the impending violence. But it was Evelyn who broke the standoff. She stepped out from behind her mother and walked toward Garrett's horse, her small voice cutting through the wind and animosity. "Why are you so mad?" she asked, looking up at him with honest curiosity. "They just wanted to say thank you for the water." Garrett stared down at her, clearly unprepared for a direct question from a child. For a second, his sneer faltered. "Get back, little girl," he said, but the venom was gone from his voice. "This ain't for kids, but it started with a kid," Evelyn replied. "Their baby was thirsty, so I gave him my water. Now they want to give me a blanket." It seems fair. The simplicity of her reasoning hung in the air, a direct challenge to the complex hatred that fueled Garrett and his men. A 6-year-old girl had reduced their entire conflict to its basic elements: need, help, and gratitude. Takakota watched the exchange intently, his gaze shifting between the innocent child and the men who embodied the very reason peace was so elusive. "Your daughter speaks a wisdom that shames grown men," he said quietly to Samuel. Perhaps it is time for the children to lead, but Garrett's momentary confusion was hardening back into rage. The way his hand moved toward his pistol suggested he was not interested in any lessons. For some people choose hatred so completely that even a child's innocence feels like a threat to the darkness they inhabit. Garrett's hand paused over his weapon, but something in Evelyn's unflinching stare seemed to hold him in place. Everyone watched in tense silence as a 6-year-old girl faced down a man known for his brutality. "You know what I think," Evelyn said, utterly unaware of her peril. "I think you're thirsty, too. And when people get really thirsty, sometimes they get angry instead of just asking for a drink." The word struck Garrett with the force of a physical blow. His scarred face contorted with emotions he clearly fought to suppress. His men shifted, unsure how to react to a child treating their leader like a person in need. Elena moved to pull her daughter back, but Takakota raised a hand to stop her. The old leader saw something unfolding that was larger than the immediate danger. "That's enough talk from a child," Garrett snarled, his anger flooding back. "You people pack up this little friendship party and get moving. You ain't welcome here." But as he spoke, the wind, which had howled for days, began to die down. The driving snow softened to gentle flakes. And through the clearing air, everyone saw something that gave them pause. More lights were approaching in the distance, not the harsh torches of fighters, but the warm glow of lanterns carried by families. Settlers from the nearby homesteads, drawn by news of the storm and concern for their neighbors. "Well, now," Morrison mumbled. "Looks like we're about to have a real town meeting." The approaching settlers included women, children, and elders, all bundled against the cold, moving with purpose. As they drew near, their lantern light illuminated the scene: tribal members and settlers standing together, gifts arranged in the snow, and a small girl at the very center. Garrett saw them coming and his face grew hard. Perfect. Now we have witnesses to this foolishness. But the settlers' reactions were not what he anticipated. The first to arrive was an elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, whose own granddaughter was Evelyn's age. "What's going on here?" she asked, her gaze taking in the mixed group with curiosity, not fear. "The little one, she saved our baby," Iona said, her English halting but clear. She held up her infant, now warm and content. "She gave her water so our son could live." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened as she looked from the baby to Evelyn to the gifts. "Land sakes, child! You saved this little 1-inch." Evelyn nodded shyly, overwhelmed by the attention. But more settlers were arriving, and the story was spreading through the crowd. Instead of fear, their faces showed wonder. "That's the finest thing I've heard all winter," one woman said softly. A young father holding his own son stepped forward. Takes real courage to give your last water to a stranger. Garrett saw his support dissolving. These were not men looking for a fight, they were families who understood kindness and the value of a child's life. "You're all being fooled," he yelled desperately. "It's a trick. They're trying to soften you up," but Takakota stepped forward, addressing the assembled settlers. "Your child did something our people will remember for generations," he said, his voice carrying in the now calm air. She saw past the things that divide us and acted from her heart. "This is not a trick. This is the spirit that can heal the wounds between our peoples," he signaled to his tribe, who began to unpack more bundles. "We brought gifts not just for the child, but for all who shelter here. Food to share, medicine to heal, first to keep everyone warm." The settlers looked at one another in astonishment. They had come expecting to find conflict but instead found something that challenged everything they had been taught to fear. But Garrett was not done. His face was flushed with rage, his hand now resting on his pistol. "This ends now," he growled. "I won't stand by and watch good people be poisoned by their lies." The moment balanced on a razor's edge. The greatest threat to hatred is not always opposition, but the simple power of connection, and some will do anything to stop that connection from forming. What happened next would be retold for decades. As Garrett's hand moved for his weapon, everyone knew they stood at a precipice that would define their communities. But it was Mrs. Patterson who moved first. The elderly woman stepped directly between Garrett and the tribe, her hands on her hips. "Garrett Mitchell," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "You put that hand away. There's been enough violence in this land for 10 lifetimes, and I won't have more of it started over a child's good deed." Other settlers began to move, not away, but closer. They formed a protective circle around Evelyn and the tribal members, their lanterns creating a warm ring of light that pushed back the darkness and the cold prejudice Garrett embodied. "These people came in peace," said the young father, shifting his son on his hip. "They came to honor what this little girl did. If we can't respect that, what are we?" Garrett looked around for support, but even his own men now seemed hesitant, their appetite for a fight vanishing in the face of families and elders. Takakota stepped forward, his hands open. "I have lived through many seasons of war," he said, his voice heavy with experience. "I have seen the cost of hatred to both our peoples. Tonight, a child showed us another path." He gestured to Evelyn, who watched with wide, serious eyes. She did not see an enemy baby or a settler baby. She saw a child in need and acted from her heart. "It is time for the adults to learn from such wisdom." The tribal leader reached into his coat and brought out a peace pipe, carved from white stone. "In my tradition, this pipe seals peace between peoples. Tonight, I will share it with any who choose peace over conflict." Samuel found himself stepping forward, his heart pounding. "I'll smoke with you," he said, his voice steady. "My daughter showed more courage tonight than I have in years." One by one, other settlers came forward, Mrs. Patterson, the young father, even Morrison from his trading post. Only Garrett and his men were left standing apart, isolated by their own hate. Takakota lit the pipe with reverence and passed it to Samuel. As the two men shared the smoke, a profound change settled over them all. The storm was over. The stars began to emerge. And for the first time in memory, two communities long divided by fear found themselves united by the simple act of a 6-year-old girl. Iona approached Evelyn and gently draped the magnificent woven blanket over her shoulders. The child looked up and smiled, a gesture that needed no words, and Iona smiled back, tears of gratitude freezing on her cheeks. Garrett turned his horse and rode into the night, his men trailing behind him. His hatred had found no fertile ground here, defeated not by violence, but by simple human decency. As the two communities began to share food and stories around a fire built with wood from both sides, Evelyn sat wrapped in her new blanket, watching the adults finally learn what she had always understood: when someone is thirsty, you give them water, and when someone shows kindness, you answer with kindness in return. The empty canteen she had given away was returned to her that night, full of fresh water, but she had received something far more precious. She had learned that the smallest act of courage could indeed change the world, one heart at a time. And in the years that followed, when the story was told, people would say that the long peace began not with treaties or laws, but with a 6-year-old girl who saw a dying baby and chose compassion over fear.